Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. One of the defining differences between the Labour Party and the National Party is that the Labour Party believes in a capable government and capable public services that can actually deliver positive outcomes for the New Zealand public, whereas the National Party believes in dismantling the government, in dismantling and minimising public services, in cutting public services. And one of the ways in which that has manifested itself is by the cuts to our police force, in particular the cuts to our police force's ability to enforce road rules and to actually be out there and keeping people safe on our roads. So whereas on this side we believe in having a police force that is capable of enforcing the law, on that side they've cut funding, they've dismantled the police force, and the result is the road toll is going up. That's what happens when you have an ideological fixation on cutting public services, is things happen like the road toll goes up. Now, good policing and good enforcement isn't the only thing that has brought down the road toll over the last few decades, but it has been an important component in bringing down the road toll. And so what happens when the National Party fixates on cutting the public sector? People die. That's the result. That's certainly the result in this case with its fixation on cutting police resources. So for decades, we had a steady drop in the road toll. But for the last 3 years, against all the trends, the road toll has steadily been going up. And what the government is trying to do through this legislation is to try to fix a gap that won't be fixed with lawmaking, with changing the law. It will only be fixed if the government actually acknowledges its mistake and starts to fund our police force properly. And so this law makes a number of other changes as well, which are all fine, and we'll support them, and we look forward to having the conversation at Select Committee. But if the government isn't prepared to actually resource its public sector to enforce these law changes, then we're all wasting our time. So, I mean, of course, ride sharing is here. It has had a huge impact on the taxi industry. It's had a positive impact for a lot of consumers. It certainly has brought prices down for a lot of consumers. And so it's appropriate that as technology has changed the landscape, that we respond to that in the legislation. But it's absolutely pointless if the government is not prepared to enforce the law. And in this space of private vehicle transport, it is already failing to enforce the law. The government is failing to enforce the laws we have right now. We have one particular ride-sharing company that proudly flouts the law. It came to Select Committee and told us how proud it was about flouting the law. And the government's response has been utterly limp. And I'm concerned that these changes, many of them are extremely positive. Now, let's go through some of the changes. That drivers will no longer need to have an area knowledge certificate. Well, all the drivers have got GPS. That kind of makes sense. I must say, a couple of my taxi drivers have said, well, actually, one of the things about having your local knowledge is you know when the GPS is going to take you through all the traffic lights, and your own local knowledge and actually knows that there is a much quicker route than just following the GPS blindly. But actually, you know, in the 21st century with that kind of technology, that makes sense. Not requiring a driver to have passed a full licence every 5 years. I think that's perfectly reasonable, so long as we ensure that those drivers still have a P endorsement, which this bill says, yes, they will still have to have a P endorsement. The problem is there are ride-sharing drivers driving passengers around New Zealand today without a P endorsement. They're breaking the law, and this government doesn't do anything about it. So the government says, we're going to keep the P endorsement in the law. That's a really important component of keeping strong law to protect passengers, to protect other drivers on the road, and we're going to keep it in this law, but we're not really going to bother enforcing it, because that costs money. And the National Party is ideologically fixated on a smaller public service, so they're not really going to enforce it. And it's going to be even harder to enforce it, because you can tell when a taxi is driving down the road. It's got a sign on top of it, and it's got signs on the side of it. You can't tell when a private vehicle that's being used for ride sharing is driving around. You can't tell just by looking at it. So enforcement becomes a whole lot harder, in fact. And so the government actually needs to resource the enforcement agencies to tackle that much more difficult problem of enforcement, of actually figuring out who is operating a ride-sharing vehicle and whether or not they are adhering to this law that we're debating at first reading right now. But the government has no plans to ensure that the resources are there to enforce this law. The government doesn't care that we've already got people breaking the law, putting people at risk. They don't care. They just don't care. That's why the road toll's going up. Just a lack of care is what it comes down to ultimately. So you know, we can debate this. We can feel really good. We can feel really good that we're passing new legislation. But so long as we've got a government that is that disinterested in public safety, then passing all these laws make absolutely no changes at all, really. In reality, and the road toll will continue to go up. We can bring in alcohol interlocks. That's great. We support that. We think that's a fantastic initiative. We'd strengthen the framework for managing public transport fare evasion. Fine, no problem. Create more effective deterrents to reduce the incidence of fleeing drivers. Great. Let's do all that stuff. Wonderful. Who's going to enforce it? Where are the resources? How is this government going to make sure that our overstretched police force actually has the resources to deal with these things? Where's the backing of our frontline public servants? Where is it? It certainly isn't coming from this government, who cut funding, put more pressure on that workforce, put greater demands on them, pass legislation like this that says there's more enforcement that you're going to have to do. You're going to have to do more with less. And then they're surprised when bad things happen. They're surprised when it goes wrong. They sell themselves and the public this story that you can endlessly cut funding to the public sector and nothing will change. Nothing will go wrong. You can squeeze people harder and harder and harder, put more expectations on them, and nothing's going to go wrong. And then when the road toll goes up, well, oh, that's a surprise. We need to change the law. We need to change the law, bring it into the 21st century. This is the problem with this government. This is the fundamental problem with this government, is their ideological fixation on a variety of things. So why they can't deal with the housing crisis, because they just can't bring themselves to intervene in the housing market. It's just not in their DNA. It's just not what the National Party does. And likewise, properly funding our public services, like the police, just isn't in the National Party's DNA. They can't do it. So when we have issues like this, we have to actually ask ourselves, who is capable of responding to them? And time again, the National Party demonstrate that they're just not capable of it. They often know what the answer is, but they can't bring themselves to implement that answer because it's just not in their DNA. And so I support this legislation. I suspect that there are aspects of it that aren't perfect yet, and that's why we're going to go to the Select Committee, and I look forward to hearing from all the submitters. I particularly look forward to the people who are operating in this space, the traditional taxi companies and the ride-sharing companies. I really want to make sure we do everything we can to get this law right. But all our work, and I say this of the National Party MPs as well, who are here just like us, they're legislators. This is the way in which we get to have an influence. This is the way in which we try to create a better society. All our work will be for nothing if the government is not actually prepared to put the resources in to implement this legislation, to enforce this legislation, sir. So I support this bill. Let's take it to Select Committee. But if we really want to bring the road toll down, if we really want to see real change for the better in New Zealand, then there's only one answer, and that answer is change the government.